In November of 1820, a small whaleship from Nantucket was floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from the coast of South America. Her name was Essex. She was not a warship. She was not a grand passenger liner. She was an old working vessel built for one purpose: to hunt sperm whales, fill her hold with oil, and come home with enough profit to make the danger seem worth it. That morning, the sea was calm. The weather was good. The crew had been searching for whales for days, and when the lookout finally saw spouts on the horizon, it should have been the beginning of a successful hunt. Instead, it became one of the most disturbing survival stories ever recorded at sea. Because the whale did not run. It turned toward the ship. And after it struck the Essex, the worst part of the story had not even begun. The Essex had sailed from Nantucket in August of 1819. Nantucket was one of the centers of the American whaling industry, and voyages like this could last for years. The men who signed on knew they were leaving home for a long time. They knew they would round Cape Horn, cross remote waters, and spend months chasing animals that could destroy a small boat with a single movement of the tail. But whaling was work. Brutal work, dangerous work, but work that powered lamps, factories, machines, and fortunes. Whale oil was money, and Nantucket had built an entire world around it. The captain of the Essex was George Pollard Jr. His first mate was Owen Chase. The second mate was Matthew Joy. Among the crew was a teenage cabin boy named Thomas Nickerson, still young enough that the scale of the ocean must have felt almost impossible to understand. The Essex was not a large ship. She was small for the work she was doing, and by the time she reached the far Pacific, she had already been tested. Early in the voyage, she had been knocked down by a squall in the Atlantic. She had made the hard passage around Cape Horn. She had spent months hunting along the coast of South America and then pushed farther out toward more distant whaling grounds. By late 1820, the ship was deep in the Pacific, in a place where rescue was not something a man could count on. Out there, a mistake did not echo through a harbor. It disappeared into blue water. On November 20th, 1820, the Essex found whales. The men lowered their whaleboats. These were not lifeboats in the modern sense. They were narrow, fast, open boats designed to carry a handful of men close enough to a whale to strike it with a harpoon. They were built for speed and maneuvering, not for crossing an ocean. The hunt began badly. Owen Chase's boat got close to a whale, but the animal's tail smashed into it and opened a hole in the side. Chase had to cut the line and return to the Essex for repairs. Meanwhile, other boats had fastened to whales and were being dragged away from the ship. So Chase climbed aboard the Essex and began working on the damaged boat. He wanted to repair it quickly and get back into the hunt. Then the men on the ship saw something strange. A large sperm whale was near the Essex, bigger than the others. Later, the men estimated it at about 85 feet long. It floated on the surface, close enough for them to see its huge, blunt head and scarred body. At first, it did not seem like an immediate threat. Then, it began to move. The whale came toward the ship, slowly at first, then faster. Its tail drove it forward. Water rose around its head. The men shouted. Chase called for the helm to be put hard up, but there was no time. The whale struck the Essex. The impact shook the ship as if she had hit a rock. Men were knocked off their feet. The hull was damaged. The crew stared at one another, stunned by what had just happened. To the whalemen, this was almost unthinkable. Whales fought boats. Whales smashed boats. Whales dragged men through the water on harpoon lines. But a whale deliberately striking a whaleship itself was something different. For a moment, the whale lay near the ship as if stunned by its own blow. Chase grabbed a lance. He had the chance to strike back. But then he saw that the whale was close to the rudder. If the animal lashed out and destroyed the steering, the Essex would be helpless in one of the loneliest parts of the world. So he held back. The whale moved away. Then it turned again. This second approach is the moment that made the Essex a legend. The whale came back toward the ship and struck again, this time with even more devastating effect. The Essex was holed. Water began to pour in. The vessel that had carried the crew across oceans was now dying beneath their feet. The men still had a ship under them, but they no longer had safety. They had time only because the Essex did not vanish immediately. She settled slowly enough for them to salvage what they could. They took water. They took hardtack. They took tools, sails, navigational instruments, and anything that might keep 3 open boats alive for more than a few days. They tried to make the whaleboats more seaworthy, raising their sides and preparing them for a journey they had never been built to make. On November 22nd, 2 days after the attack, the crew left the Essex. 20 men climbed into 3 small boats. Behind them was the wreck of their ship. Ahead of them was the Pacific. And then came the decision that shaped everything that followed. There were islands to the west. Some were far, but not as far as the coast of South America. Captain Pollard considered heading that way. With the winds and currents, a western route may have given the boats a better chance, but the men were afraid. They had heard stories, rumors, and old sailor warnings about islands in the Pacific and the people who lived there. They feared that if they landed, they might be killed. In a terrible irony, fear of cannibalism on land helped push them toward a voyage where cannibalism would eventually happen at sea. Chase and Joy argued for the coast of South America. It was much farther. It meant trying to work south until they could catch winds that might carry them east. It meant weeks in open boats under sun, rain, hunger, thirst, and uncertainty. But it sounded to them like civilization. So they chose the long route. At first, there was still order. The boats stayed near one another. Rations were measured. The men tried to sail and row with discipline. Each day they watched the water, the sky, and the horizon, hoping for a sail. The ocean gave them almost nothing. Their bread became wet with salt water. Their thirst grew worse. The sun burned them. Their bodies weakened. The men who had once hunted whales from these same kinds of boats were now trapped in them, waiting for the sea to decide whether they would live. After weeks of suffering, they reached land. It should have been salvation. The island was Henderson Island, a remote coral island in the South Pacific. The men came ashore exhausted and starving. For a brief time, they found food. They found birds, eggs, and water in limited places. They felt earth under their feet again. But Henderson was not the rescue they needed. The island was too isolated. The food was limited. Most of the men believed that if they stayed, they might die there without ever being found. So the group split. 3 men chose to remain on the island: Thomas Chappell, Seth Weeks, and William Wright. The others returned to the boats and pushed back into the open sea. That choice saved the 3 men. They would later be rescued. For the men who left, the nightmare deepened. The boats became separated. Once they lost sight of one another, each boat became its own small world of hunger, fear, and impossible decisions. Matthew Joy, already weak, died. Others followed. The men tried to hold on to the rules of ordinary life, but ordinary life was now far behind them. The bodies of the dead became part of the story in the most painful way possible. The survivors resorted to cannibalism. There is no reason to dress that up, and no reason to make it uglier than it already is. These were starving men in open boats, far from land, past the edge of what most people can imagine. Some ate the bodies of men who had died. In Pollard's boat, the situation became even more desperate. Lots were drawn. Owen Coffin, Pollard's young cousin, was selected. Another lot was drawn to decide who would carry it out. Coffin was shot and eaten. Pollard survived, but that moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. In Chase's boat, the men were also close to the end. Owen Chase, Benjamin Lawrence, and Thomas Nickerson were skeletal, sunburned, and barely alive. They had been at sea for nearly 3 months since the Essex sank. Hope had become something fragile, almost dangerous, because each new horizon could break it again. Then, on February 18, 1821, Lawrence saw a sail. The ship was the Indian, a British merchant vessel. When it reached the whaleboat, the men inside were too weak to climb aboard. They had to be lifted from the boat. 5 days later, Captain Pollard and Charles Ramsdell were found by the whaleship Dauphin. They too were alive, but only just. Of the 20 men who had left the Essex in the whaleboats, 8 survived. Chase, Lawrence, and Nickerson survived from Chase's boat. Pollard and Ramsdell survived from Pollard's boat. Chappell, Weeks, and Wright survived after staying behind on Henderson Island. Others were dead. Some were lost without a final witness. One boat disappeared and was never recovered with certainty. When the survivors returned to the world, the story traveled quickly through whaling circles. It was almost too terrible to believe. A whale had sunk a ship, and the crew had crossed the edge of human endurance in 3 small boats. Owen Chase wrote his account soon after returning. Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy, wrote his version much later in life. Their memories did not match in every detail, but together they gave history a rare thing. 2 survivor perspectives from the same disaster. Years later, Herman Melville heard the story. The sinking of the Essex helped inspire Moby-Dick, but the real story is not the same as the novel. In fiction, the whale is the climax. In the Essex disaster, the whale is the door that opens onto something worse. That is what makes the Essex so haunting. The attack itself lasted minutes. The survival ordeal lasted months. And the most frightening decisions were not made by the whale. They were made by men in tiny boats, holding maps, rationing bread, fearing the wrong shore, and trying to choose the least impossible way to live. It is easy, from a safe room, to look back and say they should have gone west. They should have trusted the islands. They should have understood the winds. They should have chosen differently. But the men of the Essex were not looking at a map on a screen. They were exhausted, frightened, injured, and trapped in an ocean that did not care what made sense later. They chose the route they thought gave them the best chance, and that choice became part of the tragedy. The Essex began as a whaling voyage. It became a shipwreck. Then it became a test of fear, leadership, prejudice, endurance, and the thin line between survival and collapse. If you want more true survival stories from the sea, subscribe to Deep Water. These stories are not legends. They happen to real people, in real water, with real choices that still feel impossible 2 centuries later. And now, I want to know what you think. If you had been in one of those boats after the Essex sank, would you have chosen the nearer islands to the west, or the long route toward South America?